While paying for the venue, I heard my fiancé's bridesmaid say, "Hope she tells him before the wedding." I asked what she meant. She ran. I remember the day with unnatural clarity, as if every detail was pressed into me like a hot iron brand. The sun was harsh, reflecting off the glass front of the reception hall where Isabel and I had decided to hold our wedding. I had taken the morning off work specifically to handle the final payment. A silly, small task in the grand scheme of things, but it felt important, symbolic, even. Paying for the venue was like laying down the cornerstone of our marriage, the final step before everything was officially sealed. I signed the paperwork at the front desk, wrote the check, and slipped it into the folder the manager pushed across the counter. That's when I heard it. Not from Isabel, not from a stranger, but from Sophie, one of Isabel's closest bridesmaids, someone I'd known casually through parties and dinners over the past 2 years. She was just a few feet away in the hallway, speaking to another girl from the bridal party. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried just enough in the quiet corridor. "Hope she tells him before the wedding." I froze. It wasn't laughter, it wasn't gossip. It was whispered with a strain of urgency, the kind of sentence you let slip when nerves and guilt bubble too high to contain. I turned my head sharply, and our eyes met through the glass door. Sophie's face drained of color. She looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar, only this wasn't something as innocent. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, stepping toward her. Her eyes widened, panic seizing her. She stammered, shaking her head, fumbling with the folder in her hands. I didn't mean anything, Nathan. I just..." But before I could press further, she bolted, literally ran down the corridor, nearly colliding with one of the staff setting up tables in the adjoining room. I called after her, but she didn't look back. She left so quickly she didn't notice the folder she dropped on the floor. When I picked it up, I expected it to be a harmless binder of decoration notes or dress fittings. Instead, it was a messy stack of receipts, half crumpled, shoved together without care. My eyes darted over them as my pulse picked up. 2 receipts immediately stood out, both from a medical clinic on the other side of town, dated within the last few months. One listed consultation, the other laboratory services. Neither had Isabel's name printed, but Sophie's panicked reaction told me everything. This wasn't routine. I shoved the folder under my arm, finished my paperwork with the manager on autopilot, and walked out to the parking lot. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. The words repeated in my head. "Hope she tells him before the wedding." Tells me what? What possible truth could be so dangerous that Sophie would rather sprint out of the building than explain? I thought about Isabel on the drive home. How she had smiled at me the night before, leaning against me on the couch while talking about the seating chart. Nothing about her demeanor hinted at fear. If anything, she seemed calmer in recent weeks, as though she had quietly decided something. But once I started thinking, little things began to stack up in my memory. The first was money. Isabel had been oddly evasive about certain expenses. I handled most of the wedding finances, but she insisted on covering her dress and some of the small things. It seemed fair at the time, but looking back, she had been touchy, defensive, whenever I asked specifics. The second was her phone habits. She had always been private, but lately, she flipped her phone face down when I entered the room, or took calls on the balcony instead of next to me. She said it was her sister, her mother, work. The explanations had been quick and believable enough in the moment. The third was timing. 3 weeks ago, she canceled dinner plans last minute, claiming her stomach hurt. She didn't want me to visit, said she needed rest. At the time, I accepted it, but I remembered how she avoided my eyes the next day when I dropped off soup. These were small details, but once suspicion sets in, every memory feels like a clue. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made up my mind. Confronting Isabel right then would be reckless. She'd deny, deflect, maybe even cry, and I would walk away with nothing but guilt for doubting her. If I wanted the truth, I needed leverage. And the only leverage available was Sophie. That night, I barely slept. Isabel lay beside me, her breathing soft, her body curled toward the edge of the bed. I stared at the ceiling, watching shadows slide across the plaster as cars passed outside. I kept hearing Sophie's whisper, replaying her terrified expression. At 2 in the morning, I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen. I spread Sophie's receipts on the table. One of them listed the date of laboratory services. Out of curiosity, I cross-checked the date with my calendar. My stomach twisted. That was the same week I had been away on a month-long business trip in Colorado. I remembered that trip vividly. It was grueling, long nights, endless client meetings. Isabel had texted me every day, sent photos of herself cooking or curled up with movies. She'd sounded lonely, counting down the days until I came home. But here was a receipt suggesting something else had occupied her time. I opened Isabel's phone bill online, scrolling through call logs. At first, nothing stood out. But then I noticed a cluster of repeated calls to an unfamiliar number during that same month. Sometimes twice a day, sometimes at odd hours. Always short, just a few minutes. Whoever it was, they weren't in her regular circle. The pieces didn't fit together neatly, but they overlapped just enough to set my nerves on fire. Medical visits. Receipts hidden in Sophie's folder. Phone calls to someone I didn't recognize. I pressed my palms against the table, my chest tight. I didn't want to leap to conclusions. But if Sophie's whisper was tied to these receipts, then Isabel wasn't just hiding small secrets. She was sitting on something explosive, something that could obliterate our marriage before it began. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start. The next morning, I told Isabel I had an early meeting at work. She kissed my cheek, distracted, scrolling through her phone as she sipped coffee. I studied her face for a moment longer than usual, wondering how much she could hide behind that calm expression. Then I left, but I didn't go to work. I drove straight to Sophie's apartment. I rehearsed the conversation in my head during the drive. If she tried to brush me off, I would push harder. If she lied, I would let her know I had the receipts. And if she cracked, if she admitted what Isabel was hiding, then I'd finally know what I was dealing with. I parked down the street, took a deep breath, and climbed the stairs to her door. My knuckles hovered for a moment, then knocked firmly. Sophie opened the door in a sweatshirt, her hair messy, clearly not expecting me. The color drained from her face again the second she saw me. "Nathan," she said carefully, her eyes flicking left and right, as if considering slamming the door. I didn't smile. I didn't greet her warmly. I simply held up the folder I'd taken yesterday. "We need to talk." And in that moment, I knew I wasn't leaving without the truth. Sophie's eyes shifted quickly, her hand gripping the edge of the door as if she were weighing whether to slam it shut and pretend she was never home. I held her gaze without flinching, clutching the folder under my arm. My silence spoke for me, and I could see the panic crawl up her throat. She let me in reluctantly, her apartment a mess of coffee mugs and unfolded laundry. She hovered near the kitchen counter while I set the folder down and spread the papers out like evidence at a trial. The receipts sat there, accusing in their simplicity. I told her I already knew these were connected to Isabel, that I wasn't stupid, and that I wasn't leaving without answers. She started fidgeting with the drawstring of her sweatshirt, muttering half-sentences that led nowhere. I pressed harder, leaning in, reminding her that if she kept covering for Isabel, she'd be part of the fallout when this all came out anyway. My voice was calm but edged, the kind of calm that made it clear I wasn't going to be pacified with vague excuses. She bit her lip, glanced at the folder again, and then at me. I could see her resolve breaking like ice under pressure. Finally, she exhaled sharply, slumping into the chair at the table. She covered her face with both hands and let out a sound that was half sigh, half groan. I didn't say anything. I just waited. And then it came. Not all at once, but in fragments, her voice low, trembling. Each word weighted like it had been burning her tongue for weeks. Isabel had been hiding something so big she couldn't bring herself to tell me. She had been avoiding the confrontation, convincing herself it could wait until after the wedding, or perhaps forever if Sophie and Rachel kept their silence. The truth hit me like a blunt weapon when Sophie finally admitted it. Isabel was pregnant. For a second, my mind refused to process it. Pregnant. The word hung in the air, twisting and reshaping every moment of the past few months. Suddenly the nausea excuses, the canceled plans, the secrecy around money, they all snapped into place like puzzle pieces. It wasn't stress or overwork or small lies. It was something monumental. But the worst part came when Sophie explained why Isabel hadn't told me. Because the timeline didn't add up. Because she knew I would notice immediately what she had hoped no one would say out loud. The conception date was unmistakable. Isabel had gone to the clinic for confirmation while I was away on my month-long business trip to Colorado. That was the part that hollowed me out. I remembered the dates precisely, because that trip had been hell. Endless meetings, a suffocating hotel room, late-night phone calls where Isabel had told me how much she missed me. Every text she sent me, every picture of her at home alone, it all seemed so believable at the time. But it was all theater. Behind the curtain, something else was happening. I sat back in the chair, my chest tightening as the realization dug in. If she was pregnant, it couldn't be mine. It was biologically impossible. While I was sitting in boardrooms hundreds of miles away, someone else had been in my place. The nausea in my stomach wasn't from shock alone. It was from the insult of it all. The months of planning, the sacrifices I had made, the way I had poured myself into building a life with Isabel, only to find out she had been keeping the biggest betrayal imaginable just beneath the surface. Sophie's eyes glistened as she looked at me, her face a mixture of guilt and fear. She kept insisting Isabel had wanted to tell me, that she hadn't meant for it to go this far, that she was scared of losing everything. None of it mattered. The intent didn't erase the fact. The silence didn't soften the blow. All it meant was that every day that passed had been a day of compounded lies. I asked Sophie if she knew who the father was, but she hesitated. Her silence was louder than an answer. That told me enough. There was someone. A face, a name, a man who had stood where I should have been, who had left me unknowingly raising the thought of his child. I drove home with my head pounding, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Isabel wasn't home yet. Her car was gone, and the house was silent. For a moment, I just sat in the driveway, staring at the familiar brick walls that no longer felt like a home, but like a stage set for a play I'd been duped into starring in. When I finally stepped inside, the air felt different, stale with the weight of deception. I went straight to the office and pulled out the calendar where we'd marked important dates. Engagement photos, venue meetings, my Colorado trip. I stared at the month of April, tracing the days I had been gone. I cross-checked the clinic receipt against those weeks. The match was undeniable. Isabel had conceived while I was away. I dropped into the chair, my mind racing. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It was anchored to dates and facts that no one could dispute. This wasn't paranoia or insecurity. This was evidence. I thought back to the calls I had seen on her phone bill, the repeated number she contacted during my trip. Short calls, sometimes twice a day, always consistent. My chest clenched as I considered the possibility that this number belonged to him, the father of the child she now carried. I printed out the phone records, spread them next to the receipts, and stared at the growing pile of proof. Piece by piece, the image sharpened. Sophie hadn't given me the whole picture, but she had given me enough to know that Isabel had betrayed me in a way that went beyond a fling. She hadn't just cheated. She had planned to build a life with me while carrying another man's child. The thought sickened me. I couldn't decide what was worse, that she had done it at all, or that she had smiled at me every night since and pretended everything was fine. That night, Isabel came home late, humming softly as she set her purse down. I watched her from the kitchen doorway, every movement of hers suddenly alien. She kissed me on the cheek as though nothing in the world was wrong. I forced a smile back, masking the storm inside me. Confronting her then would have been too easy for her. She'd twist it, cry, deflect, and I would walk away with nothing but anger. No, I needed more. I needed to know who he was. As I lay in bed that night, Isabel asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling again. My mind no longer replayed Sophie's whisper. It replayed the cold reality that the woman next to me carried a child that couldn't be mine. And yet she lay there, peaceful, as if she had already decided to keep pretending until the ring was on her finger. I turned onto my side, staring at the faint glow of her phone on the nightstand. The same phone that had dialed that number dozens of times while I was gone. My jaw clenched. Tomorrow, I would find out who it belonged to. I didn't know where the trail would lead, but I knew one thing with certainty. The wedding wasn't just at risk anymore. The life I thought I was stepping into was built on quicksand, and I wasn't about to sink quietly. I woke the next morning with my jaw tight and my head aching. Isabel was already gone, her car missing from the driveway when I looked out the window. She had left a note on the counter about errands for the wedding, written in the same handwriting that had filled love letters in our first months together. I traced the lines of her script with my eyes and felt a strange chill. The same hand that had promised forever was now hiding the cruelest secret I had ever faced. I sat down at the kitchen table, the phone bill spread out in front of me. The number appeared again and again, always around the time I had been away in Colorado. I searched the digits online but got nothing useful, no names, just a vague location linked to a nearby cell tower. Whoever he was, he had been careful. That didn't matter. There were other ways to smoke out the truth. I decided the next step wasn't digital, it was human. Sophie had cracked under pressure, but she had only given me part of the story. If she knew, then Rachel probably knew too. And Rachel had always been more observant, less flighty. She was the type to notice details even when she didn't want to. I drove to her apartment complex without calling ahead. The air felt heavy, as though the city itself carried the weight of what I was about to confirm. I knocked firmly on her door, and when she opened it, her face mirrored Sophie's the day before, startled, guilty, a flicker of dread. I didn't waste time. I told her I had spoken to Sophie, that I already knew Isabel was pregnant, and that it wasn't mine. I let my words hang there like a blade suspended above her head. Rachel froze, then tried to compose herself, but her lips trembled. I stepped inside without waiting for permission and closed the door behind me. Rachel's apartment was tidier than Sophie's, but the tension inside was worse. She hovered near the couch, her hands clasped tightly. I pressed her the way I had pressed Sophie, only harder. She was cornered, and she knew it. At first, she repeated the same lines Sophie had used. Isabel was scared. Isabel wanted to tell me but couldn't. Isabel thought she'd lose me. But I cut her off. telling her I already knew the conception happened during my Colorado trip. There was no wiggle room, no ambiguity. Rachel paled, because she knew the timeline sealed Isabel's guilt beyond denial. After a long silence, Rachel sank into the couch and looked away from me. Her voice was quiet, but every word carved deeper. Isabel hadn't been alone while I was gone. She had been seen more than once with a man from her office, someone she had been close to for months. His name was Adrian. The name was unfamiliar, but it hit like a hammer anyway. Adrian, a man I had never met, who had walked into Isabel's life through work while I was busy building our future. A man who had taken what was mine in the 1 month I was away. Rachel admitted she had covered for Isabel, that the bridesmaids had whispered about it, but kept it quiet, convinced Isabel would come clean before the wedding. When the pregnancy was confirmed, panic took over, and the plan became silence. Marry me first, hope the dates blurred, hope I never questioned. I sat there, my fists clenched, staring at the floor while Rachel's voice droned like a confession in a courtroom. My ears rang with the sound of my own pulse. Adrian. The name alone felt poisonous. I left without thanking her, slamming the door harder than I intended. My chest burned with rage, but underneath was something colder, clarity. Now I had a name, and names left trails. Back home, I searched through Isabel's work directory online until I found him. His face stared back at me from a corporate headshot, mid-30s, clean-cut, the kind of face people trusted. I memorized every feature, feeling bile rise in my throat. I dug deeper, scanning his LinkedIn profile, his public social media. He wasn't married, but he wasn't single either. A few posts hinted at someone in his life, though not clearly. The rage in me wanted to storm into his office and drag him into the open. But I stopped myself. That would give Isabel room to twist things, to frame me as paranoid or unstable. No, I needed proof that even she couldn't deny. The receipts and phone records were a start, but they weren't enough. I needed confirmation straight from him. I waited until evening, when I knew Isabel was out with her mother, before driving across town. Adrian lived in a modest townhouse complex not far from the office. I parked a few units away and sat in the dark, my fingers tapping the steering wheel. My heart pounded with anticipation and fury, but I forced myself to wait until the lights dimmed inside his unit. Then I walked up and knocked. He opened the door in a t-shirt, surprise flashing across his face. He didn't know me, but I knew him instantly. His eyes darted over me like he was running a quick calculation. I introduced myself as Isabel's fiancé, and that was enough. His face shifted in an instant, guilt pouring through every line. I didn't need theatrics. I told him I already knew. I told him Isabel was pregnant and that the timing lined up exactly with when I was gone. My voice was low, controlled, but edged with steel. He stared at me for a long moment, his lips parting like he might deny it. But then he sighed, rubbed his face, and admitted it. Yes, he and Isabel had been involved. It hadn't been serious at first. A few dinners, nights that blurred into something more. She had told him I existed, but painted me as distant, absent, consumed by work. He claimed he ended it when she revealed we were engaged. He said he hadn't spoken to her since, that he hadn't known about the pregnancy. I wanted to smash my fist into his face, but I didn't. Violence would only complicate things, drag me into trouble. Instead, I let his words burn into my memory. His admission was all I needed. I turned and walked away before he could say anything else. The night air was cool, but my body felt hot, boiling from the inside out. Isabel had been weaving a net of lies around me, hoping I would step into it blindly. But now I had the truth straight from the source. Driving home, I replayed everything in my head. Sophie's whisper. Sophie's collapse. Rachel's confirmation. Adrian's confession. The pieces fit together into a picture that was undeniable. Isabel was carrying another man's child, and she had planned to bind me to her forever before I discovered it. When I pulled into the driveway, the house glowed warmly from the living room window. Isabel was home again, curled on the couch, scrolling her phone, looking for all the world like the loving fiancé waiting for her partner to join her. My chest tightened with disgust. I sat in the car for a long time, watching the light flicker against the curtains. Tomorrow would be the rehearsal dinner. Family, friends, everyone gathered to celebrate what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Isabel was probably rehearsing her smile, planning how to keep her secret buried for one more day. But tomorrow, the mask would shatter. The morning of the rehearsal dinner arrived with a weight in my chest I couldn't shake. Isabel was cheerful, humming as she fussed over place cards and floral arrangements at the dining room table. I watched her with the detached stare of someone observing a stranger. She laughed at some message on her phone and looked up at me with soft eyes, asking if I was excited for tonight. I told her I was. The lie slid easily off my tongue, though inside I was bracing for war. I showered, dressed, and gathered my folder. Receipts, phone records, printed calendars with highlighted dates. Each piece was small on its own, but together they formed a chain too strong for her to break. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was evidence, damning and irreversible. At the restaurant that evening, families began trickling in. My parents, her parents, siblings, bridesmaids, groomsmen. Everyone was smiling, voices rising with the buzz of anticipation. Toasts were already being practiced, laughter bubbling up over clinking glasses. To anyone else, it looked like a picture-perfect night before a wedding. But for me, every face was a mask waiting to be torn away. I sat beside Isabel at the long table, her hand brushing mine, her perfume familiar and nauseating all at once. She leaned in, whispering about how glad she was that everything was coming together. I studied her profile as she spoke, and all I saw was betrayal. The same lips whispering devotion to me had whispered something else to Adrian not long ago. The same body carrying what should have been our future was carrying his. The dinner moved along, toasts offered by siblings, jokes from friends, tears from parents. I waited, letting the room warm itself with joy, letting Isabel bask in the illusion she had created. When the last toast ended, I stood. My heart thudded in my chest, but my voice was steady when I addressed the room. I thanked everyone for being there. I told them how much it meant to have our families gathered to celebrate. And then I said there was something they all needed to know before tomorrow, something Isabel had been keeping from me, and by extension, from all of them. Isabel stiffened beside me, her hand tightening on mine for a split second before pulling back. Her smile faltered, her eyes darting nervously across the room. A ripple of confusion spread among the guests. I laid the folder on the table and opened it, sliding the receipts across the polished wood. I explained what they were. Medical records from a clinic, dated precisely during the month I had been in Colorado. I showed the phone bills, the repeated calls to the same number during those weeks. I pulled out my travel itinerary, highlighting the 30 days I had been gone. Then I turned to Isabel, my eyes locked on hers, and I said it plainly. She was pregnant, but I could not be the father. The conception lined up exactly with the month I was hundreds of miles away. The room fell silent. Forks clattered against plates, glasses stilled in midair. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Isabel's father's face hardened into stone. Sophie looked down at her lap, pale as ash, while Rachel shut her eyes tight, as if bracing for an explosion. Isabel's face twisted, first with denial, then with desperation. She started insisting it wasn't what it looked like, that the dates might be wrong, that she had been planning to tell me. But the words rang hollow. Too many eyes were on her. Too much evidence was spread across the table. The more she spoke, the more frantic she sounded, and the more the truth bled through. I told them about Adrian, the man from her office, the one she had seen while I was away. I explained how Sophie had cracked, how Rachel had confirmed it, how Adrian himself had admitted their involvement. Each detail landed like a hammer strike, breaking the fragile glass of her story. Her mother sobbed quietly, shaking her head in disbelief. Her father's fists were clenched on the table, his jaw tight with fury. My father leaned back, his face unreadable, but his eyes burning with quiet disappointment. The groomsmen shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another. The bridesmaids sat frozen, guilt dripping from their expressions. Isabel tried to stand, to salvage something, but I cut her off. I said I would not marry someone who had lied to me, who had planned to trap me into raising another man's child. I told the room that the wedding was canceled, that there was nothing left to celebrate. Gasps echoed around the table, but I didn't flinch. The weight that had been crushing me for days lifted as the words left my mouth. Isabel sank back into her chair, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling. The aftermath was chaos. Her parents turned on her, demanding answers she couldn't give. The bridesmaids avoided her eyes, shame heavy on their shoulders. Guests left in hushed groups, murmurs filling the air like smoke after a fire. My family stood with me, silent, but their presence was enough. I left the restaurant without looking back at Isabel. She called after me, her voice breaking, but I didn't stop. The night air hit me like a wave, cold and sharp, but freeing. In the days that followed, everything unraveled for her. The venue canceled the booking, keeping the deposit. Vendors pulled contracts. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the wreckage. Adrian's name spread quietly through whispers at her office, staining her reputation. Her own family, humiliated, offered no shield. For me, the fallout was painful but clean. I canceled the honeymoon, closed the joint account, and boxed up her belongings. There were questions, pitying looks, but no shame. I had cut the rope before it strangled me. The hardest part was the quiet moments, lying in bed at night, remembering the way she used to laugh, the plans we had whispered to each other in the dark. But every time the sadness threatened to overwhelm me, I reminded myself of the receipts, the phone calls, the truth. Love built on lies wasn't love at all. Weeks later, I passed Isabel on the street. She looked smaller somehow, her hair pulled back hastily, her clothes wrinkled. She glanced at me, her eyes hollow, then looked away. I kept walking. There was nothing left to say. The wedding never happened. The life we had planned dissolved into dust. And though it left scars, it also left me free. Free from a marriage that would have been nothing but betrayal and resentment. Isabel had gambled that silence would protect her, that deception would carry her across the finish line. But the truth always surfaces, no matter how deep you try to bury it. And when it did, it destroyed everything she thought she had secured. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.